to find smarter answers. Our future is only as secure as our food system. What is food security? It's a huge question that can be addressed by answering other questions. Like, how can agriculture help solve the threat of climate change? Can a resilient food system start with a seed? How can technology help farmers run better businesses? How can gender equality drive food security? Can food security bring security for farmers, for economies, for the environment, for humanity? Enter the Global Food Security Index, an annual report developed by the Economist Intelligence Unit and sponsored by Corteva Agriscience. The index considers food availability, affordability, and quality and safety alongside natural resources and resilience across 113 countries. It looks beyond the surface of food security to the factors that drive it, so we can all ask smarter questions and work together to find smarter answers. Our future is only as secure as our food system. Agriculture is at the heart of it, and Corteva is at the heart of agriculture.
To this webinar on the latest Global Food Security Index. My name is Ivor Price. I'm the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Food for Mzansi, and I will be your host for this hour-long webinar. So we are live on Zoom, and at this very moment, we also have viewers tuning in from across South Africa, both on Food for Mzansi's Facebook page. I can see them trickling in at the moment, as well as Food for Mzansi's YouTube page. So we are expecting quite a lively discussion this morning. Of course, this webinar is being recorded, so you are free to view the recording afterwards. If you want to check something, maybe you couldn't join the live discussion, don't worry. It will be recorded and it will live until eternity, because things on the internet is always available. So I'm so honored to host this morning's presentation in partnership with Corteva Agriscience and AGRISA. If you have been following the news, you will know that South Africa has ranked the highest in food security out of 28 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But make no mistake though, food inadequacy and hunger are still great challenges. And this morning we are joined by experts who will be unpacking the dynamics of the Global Food Security Index specifically, and what it means for the future of South Africa. Now, I know when agriculturists in South Africa get together, there are 1,002 things we can talk about because we are quite passionate about what we do. But I am going to focus the discussion this morning on the latest Global Food Security Index and what it means for South Africa. So first up is a guy we greatly admire in the agricultural sector in Mzansi, and certainly at Food for Mzansi. Please welcome Tony Esmeraldo. He's the business director for Corteva Agriscience in South Africa, who will be doing the official opening remarks. Welcome to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you, Ivor. And thank you for everybody that joined us today. And also thank you for AgriSA that created this forum for us to share this important information with everybody involved in agriculture in South Africa. So I think, first of all, Corteva is proud to sponsor the GFSI for the past 9 years. And the question is, why are we involved in this? So we believe that the GFSI gives leaders worldwide insights that they need to ensure access to healthy and affordable food. I think the second important reason is that we need to build the resilient ag systems in all countries, including South Africa. And the 2020 GFSI results showed us the time to act is now. We need to strengthen agriculture against tough challenges like climate change, declining natural resources. I think the second important theme is that we need to support smart ag. GFSI also shown that new technology and more connected, responsive supply chains help to offset the challenges to food security as well as farmer well-being. And then lastly, to advance sustainable agriculture. It's farming for tomorrow. The GFI shows that sustainable farming is essential to food security as well as farmer productivity. We're really happy today to share as much as possible detail, and also then to engage afterwards if there's any more detail that can help anybody to advance food security in South Africa. Thank you, Ivor.
Thank you, Tony, joining us all the way from Gauteng. I'm based in Paarl in the Western Cape at the moment. And I know that our next guest is also raring to go. She's all the way from Singapore this morning. But there's been quite a significant shift in the methodology used for the Global Food Security Index. So I thought we'd kick off today's session by just going into a little poll. So at the moment, on your screens should be popping up a questionnaire, and I would like you to participate, just to kind of show us where you are. It's quite simple. You click on it, and the question simply is, the new Global Food Security Index methodology incorporates which category into the main index? Is it affordability? Is it availability? Is it natural resources and resilience? Or is it quality and safety? Which one do you think it is? We'll give it another minute while you can make your vote known before I introduce the next guest. Remember that you can also chat to us live on Facebook. Simply join Food for Mzansi's Facebook page there for discussion. You can email info@foodformzansi.co.za. It will come directly to me. At the end, we'll have an opportunity where you can pose your questions to some of the participants this morning. And of course, please feel free to tag and follow Corteva Corteva ME on Twitter, as well as Food for Mzansi. We're looking out for your questions and your comments on the various platforms. Okay, the votes are in. Let's kick off today's proceedings with a global view. And for this perspective, we are now joined by Pratima Singh. She's the project lead for the Global Food Security Index. Good morning, Pratima. I assume it's good morning there.
It's good afternoon here, Ivo, but thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be able to join you. And thanks for the, very nicely connected polling question. The results are in. I see those. The correct answer does get the majority of the vote here, with 34% going to natural resources and resilience. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but as we do so, I wanted to give you a quick introduction to myself. As Ivo mentioned, I'm based here in Asia and Singapore. It's afternoon here, but very excited to be able to join you all here in South Africa to talk about the Global Food Security Index. I am the project lead for this index, and very excited to be able to talk to you about the most recent findings, the big changes we've made, and particularly what South Africa's performance has been that Tony and I will go through together. So I'm going to start by giving you some context to the index, because I know all of you are paying attention by answering correctly the right category. But as we talk about the motivation and methodology change and why that was important in this 2020 index, I thought it would be good to start by giving you some background. So the Global Food Security Index, or GFSI, as we call it here at the EIU, is the Economist Intelligence Unit's, project since 2012. So we are now in the 9th year of the GFSI. It was launched in 2012 in partnership with Corteva Agriscience, and it essentially is a benchmarking tool that identifies the drivers of food security or food insecurity thereof across, in this year, 113 countries. But when we started way back in 2012, we started with 105 countries. And it essentially highlights Corteva's commitment to the world's farmers. We've expanded this index over the years. We've made sure that we address methodology changes, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But we also have a website, a hub, foodsecurity.eiu.com, where you can look through all of the recent findings, all of the resources. In terms of the GFSI, it's a very valuable tool for engaging policymakers and the media and academics on developments in agriculture and food security. As it's been running for so many years now, it's a powerful tool to measure progress in different countries, in different regions, and even globally. So I did mention we've made a couple of changes to the 2020 index in its 9th year. We basically have incorporated the 4th category, as you rightly pointed out, on natural resources and resilience into the main index, into the core index. So now we have 4 key pillars looking at affordability, availability, quality and safety, and natural resources and resilience. And this is allowing us to have a conversation and shaping the dialogue on food security by country, and then allows us to identify the drivers. So the GFSI is essentially looking at these different categories as drivers of food insecurity in these different countries, allows us to determine country strengths, weaknesses, areas of focus, share best practices through rigorous research, and also allows us to identify policy needs, gaps, and other food system issues that are emerging in different countries. In order to talk a little bit about why we felt the need to incorporate this 4th category into the main index, I'll give you some context. It's not a new category. In 2017, we incorporated this category as an adjustment factor to the main index. So essentially, we would have the categories of affordability, availability, and quality and safety. And we adjusted the scores with this 4th category to be able to determine the impact of natural resources and resilience on food security. However, this year in 2020, we've incorporated into the main index essentially to make sure that the dialogue on food security is now deeply interconnected and essentially inextricably intertwined with food security. We don't want it to just be an issue that is sort of connected to food security, but not directly. By incorporating it as part of the main index, it becomes a very clear 4th category in determining a country's food security. It allows us to talk about which countries are adapting and building resilience to these climate risks, and also talks about the immediate actions that are necessary. And as a result of incorporating it and making this such an area of focus and priority, it allows governments and policymakers to identify opportunities for innovation, for research and development, and to begin building capacity if they have not done so already, in order to train, educate, and essentially promote climate smart, production and consumption policies as well. This is not the only change we've made in the GFSI this year. We constantly look to improving the methodology and the framework to make sure that it continues to remain relevant in the conversation and the context today. So of course, we've added this natural resources category, but we've also made adjustments to the 3 existing categories by adjusting some metrics. For instance, we've looked at inequality adjusted levels of income in the affordability category. We've enhanced measures for market access and agricultural services. We've improved under availability, we've improved how we measure investment and adoption of agricultural R&D, adjusted how we measure agricultural infrastructure, and also, of course, added political and social barriers to access. The availability category really goes deeper into not just examining produce and, supply, which is measured in the sufficiency of supply indicator, but also looking at how easy and accessible this food and production is. And that's really where it comes down to looking at things like infrastructure, social barriers to access, and of course, food loss. Under the 3rd category of quality and safety, we've also adjusted and enhanced some of the metrics, including food safety, particularly in the context of COVID, and then, of course, also looking at nutritional standards in a more comprehensive way. I want to talk a little bit about how stakeholders use the GFSI. As I mentioned, it's looking at drivers of food insecurity. So it's essentially very intuitive policy tool for governments to be able to examine how they are able to serve their population's food requirements and needs, especially for healthy food. And so we've also had, we've engaged several governments that have either wanted to be included in the index, so starting from 105 now to 113. We've spoken with individual governments on examining their areas of focus, areas of weakness, and being able to inform their strategies going forward. Some examples here, of course, we've got the US government, Australia, China, the UAE. We continue to do this now with Malaysia and other governments in the Middle East as well. We also work with nonprofits and NGOs that are using this as an ongoing research tool to highlight the effectiveness of their country's food security efforts or global food security efforts. Of course, in South Africa, we've spoken and worked with AGRIS closely. The USAID Foundation uses a lot of our indicators and sub-indicators to measure effectiveness of food security efforts, as well as Aspen Institute, where we looked at food security and its impact on women's health in different markets. So there are lots of different ways in which the GFSI has been used as a benchmarking tool for governments, for nonprofits, and of course for the private sector as well. As a sponsor, Corteva is using this to be able to determine and highlight their commitment to farmers. We also have other private sector companies that are looking at I guess the environment, the green environment in different countries. For instance, Wells Fargo is looking at how the investment in green ag has been shaped up and is shaping up in different economies. And so companies are also using this as a way to direct their corporate social responsibility and other philanthropic efforts. All right, I've been speaking and giving you some context on GFSI, all very important, but let's dive into what exactly the findings were from a global perspective of the GFSI 2020. Now, the most important, I guess, high-level finding and key takeaway here is that the GFSI 2020 saw that the food security environment globally deteriorated for a second year in a row. These are scores, global scores of overall food security environments. And so you'll see here that in 2018, it's been consistently improving from 2012 through to 2018. So it peaked in 2018 and then deteriorated slightly in 2019, followed by a second dip in 2020, really highlighting, of course, the reversal of trend that we've seen in the latest years, which is a very worrying trend, but highlights the imminent threat, of course, of climate risks, of imminent climate risks, as well as, of course, the negative adverse shock from an economic perspective, but also overall from the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll dive deeper into what exactly is driving this, and to do so, I'll highlight that different categories, or 3 out of our 4 categories, actually saw a slight dip. In the overall score, out of the 113 countries that we have, 62 saw their score decline compared to 2019. However, when we look across here, you'll see different countries, or the variation in terms of how many countries saw their scores decline in different categories. For instance, the only silver lining, I guess, here is that at least globally, we saw availability improve only very marginally, but we saw a dip, a slight dip in quality and safety, as well as natural resources. The biggest driver of the overall decline in 2020 is very clearly the affordability category. 66 countries out of 113 saw their performance in this first affordability category decline in 2020. That's not really a shock, particularly because we know that affordability took a big hit this year. Falling incomes, rising poverty levels, and lack of social safety nets really led to this decline. So affordability and improving performance in this category should remain a priority going forward in order to help support some of that reversal that we need so tremendously in the global food security environment. Overall, just a high level, I'm sure most of you know by now, but we did see Finland top the rankings, followed by Ireland. Unsurprisingly, on the other end of the spectrum, we saw countries that have been, hit by COVID, by climate risks, as well as conflict. Countries like Yemen and Syria took a hit as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about COVID because, of course, we've addressed that, but I do want to make sure that we address the fact that this affordability decline is where we're seeing a lot of that COVID impact in this 2020 index. We're looking, of course, at shifts and changes in poverty levels, in rising inequality, a loss of incomes, and also not as effective or effectively functioning social safety nets that led to this decline. However, going forward in 2021 and even beyond, we're expected to see a continued impact on affordability, on quality and safety as well as availability because of shocks due to lockdowns, and of course, natural resources and resilience because we are seeing increased demographic stress and also, a shift away from focusing on climate risks in terms of policy. I did mention a lot and talk about food safety nets, and I do want to talk about this in just a little bit more detail. Essentially, one of the key learnings from 2020 was that we need to focus on the effective functioning of food safety nets. A lot of countries have, almost all but 3 have food safety nets, some sort of food safety nets in place. But we found in the 2020 index that only 55 countries out of 113 have food safety nets that are sufficiently funded, that are national and therefore cover the entire population and also effectively supported by governments. And so essentially it's very critical that this focus on improving the effectiveness of food safety nets remains a priority for policymakers, that they support transparent, well-targeted and stable food safety net programs. And this is because in times of normal circumstances, we don't quite feel the lack of these structural deficiencies or the gaps in these structural inequities. However, during times of crisis, which is what we've experienced and continue to experience, these gaps get exacerbated tremendously and affect in particular households and populations that are most vulnerable and that are most exposed. And therefore, the focus on providing stable, transparent, and well-targeted focus safety net programs should continue to be a big focus for governments. I did mention vulnerable groups and talk a little bit about how they tend to be the most affected. So I want to also highlight how COVID is going to impact that and why food and nutritional strategies need to be a priority going forward. Once we take a hit in affordability, generally what we see as a consequence of that in the future is that food safety and quality also takes a hit. Populations tend to, as a result of loss of incomes and lack of employment, populations and citizens tend to move towards looking at cheaper foods that may be lower in nutritional value with higher shelf lives. And as a result, over time, we see that takes an impact or takes a toll on quality and safety. By having a food security strategy and a nutritional strategy in place, governments can continue to focus on enhancing that or ensuring that the most vulnerable low-income groups are not going to be the most affected, particularly when it comes to these types of, deficiencies in the future. So in order to mitigate the deterioration in quality and safety, it's important that governments continue to prioritize food strategies. We see over time, from 2012 through to 2020, that there has been an increase in the number of countries that have a food security strategy in place. We've gone from 36 to 54 in 2020. However, a majority of countries are still lacking in ensuring that there is a dedicated food security agency or food security ministry or department that is implementing some of these strategies, right, in their population. So only 31 out of 113 countries actually have a dedicated food security agency that basically addresses the nutritional needs of these vulnerable populations. And so here's another policy lever that governments can use in order to improve their performance in the food security environment. Another point that became very clear through this index was that it was one that actually talks and combines the second category of availability along with the fourth category of natural resources and resilience. And that's volatility of agricultural production. And this remains very high. We know that climate risk continues to threaten food security going forward. We've seen several countries food volatility and production volatility because of these climate risks. The GFSI finds that 49 out of 113 countries actually experienced higher volatility in agricultural production between 2019 and 20, so in the last 2 years of the index. A lot of this is on account of much more climate-related, I guess, weather events, whether it's droughts, extreme weather. And I want to highlight here that this is not just an issue that plagues countries in Africa or Asia. This is also a problem that is visible and evident in very high-income countries, including Norway, Sweden, Australia as well. So you'll see on the visual here that this is something high-income countries average is represented by the dotted line, but you see that, of course, several European countries are above that, and South Africa, that is in the blue, is way above that. And so managing volatility through policy commitment to adaptation, tech innovation, ag R&D can be quite helpful in order to mitigate some of this unpredictable agricultural production. On a positive note, we do find that 72 countries out of our 113 did highlight agricultural adaptation in their climate policies. So there's a very clear focus on steps to mitigate the impact and adapt to a changing environment in climate policies. There's still a lot more work that can be done, particularly in middle-income countries. So here we see the commitment or percentage of countries in the GFSI that are committed to early warning measures and climate-smart agriculture. Of course, in the high-income countries, we see several of them have focused and are highly committed, while there is some level of commitment in the middle-income countries. There is still a lot of work to be done in terms of actually pushing this and making sure that agriculture and early warning and climate smart remains top of mind and priority for governments in these countries. Last few things, I wanted to take maybe shift gears and focus a little bit on the regional performance. Here you see that the overall world average by region is represented by the dotted red line, and we see some regions hover around it. For instance, Latin America, the Middle East and North Africa, as well as Asia Pacific are around the world average in terms of performance. Two regions that lead the way currently are Europe and North America. They do, of course, much better than the world average when it comes to food security. And where we see a lot more can be done in terms of improving food security is Sub-Saharan Africa. That is still, I guess, at this point below the world average, but continues to strive to move up in order to enhance food security and the enabling environment for their populations. Within Sub-Saharan Africa, we see that South Africa does lead the way. It does rank #1 out of the 28 countries included as part of Sub-Saharan Africa, and ranks 69th out of the overall 113 countries. So of course there is something to be hopeful of, and there can be a lot more that can be done in order to improve South Africa and overall Sub-Saharan Africa's performance in the GFSI. So I want to be able to have Tony dive deeper, but as we do so, maybe I'll ask a polling question. So Ivor, if you could help me with the polling question as well. I wanted to maybe ask our audience here, given this new methodology that we've used, right? We've updated the methodology and backscored all of our indicators to be able to give better, more year-on-year comparability using this new methodology. What is the ranking of South Africa? Has it dropped from 67 to 69, from 48 to 69 in 2020, from 42nd to 69, or it's something that you're looking to learn?
Thank you, Pratima, for that insightful presentation. I must tell you, South Africans are very competitive. So I can see them thinking, which one is it? Using the new methodology, South Africa's global ranking dropped from which position to which position? Is it 67 to 69, 48 to 69, 42 to 69, or are you clueless? Do you have no idea? Thank you, Pratima. We'll see you a little bit later. I must say, as much as COVID-19 has disrupted people across the globe, I also love how it forced us to innovate, especially in terms of using available technologies to make the world a lot smaller, bringing experts like Pratima directly to our homes and offices. We now have direct access to some of the world's brightest minds at the click of a button. So if you've just joined us, welcome to this webinar on the Global Food Security Index, proudly presented by Corteva Agriscience, AgriSA, and Food for Mzansi. You are just in time for the final moments of this poll as we move the discussion on specific findings about food security in South Africa. And any moment now, we'll be joined by our next speaker, because I know many of you are quite keen to learn a lot more about specific findings relating to this country, South Africa. And as you join us, Tony Esmeraldo, the business director for Corteva Agriscience in South Africa, just to talk about South Africa and specific findings relating to this country. Let's look at the results of the poll. The correct answer is South Africa has dropped from the 67th position to the 69th position. Feel free to leave your comments if you're joining us live on Zoom using the little chat box option, but you're also free to do so on Food for Mzansi's page. You're also free to do so on Food for Mzansi's YouTube page, or to simply email us info@foodformzansi.co.za. Quite a number of emails already trickling in. I'll be sure to share that with the experts any moment now. Tony Esmeraldo, welcome back.
Thank you, Ivor, and thank you, Pratima, for setting the scene, what's happening in the world. And I certainly, as Ivor said, be competitive. I think 69th is not a bad position to be in, but certainly I think, as we know, the purpose of the tool is to see where we can improve. So let me get closer to home and look at the South African scores. So I think in line with the global trends, you can see towards the end that we're also declining in terms of our score. The way that I want to deal with the presentation today is to look at from 2012 to 2020, what is the long-term trend? Because I believe that's the best way to look at trends and then see how do we project that into the future, and obviously how do we turn that around. You can see in 2012, we are at 57.4, today at 2020 at 57.8. We peaked in 2015 at 63, and then dropped in 2016, got back in 2018, and then the last 2 years, certainly it came down. Obviously, 2020 being an abnormal year from a COVID point of view, impacting not only us, but the world as well. I think that score downwards was driven by two factors that I'll spend some time on now, is basically availability and affordability. So if you look overall at the different scoring, you can see that availability, 2012, 67, down to 63. It's still a reasonable score, but a downward trend, which we'll analyze a little bit now to see why did that happen. Then secondly, availability from 50 to 49, slightly down. And there's a specific reason for that we'll get into a bit more detail just now. We really did well on quality and safety. I think the country has got good systems in place to be able to manage that with a nice score of 72. And I think on the new dimension that was brought in 2020, 43 to 49, I think we've got work to do there, but still a reasonable score for the first time measuring that. So let's move into a bit more detail here. So unfortunately, we will not have time to go into the detail of everything, but I'll touch on certain highlights, which I think is important. Happy to take questions and discussions on that. So let's start with affordability. You can see we dropped 4 points to 63, but it's still green. It's a reasonable score. If you look at, I think the green factors there, the change in average food cost, we increased that to 11.5. I think it's a really good score for South Africa. If you look at, I think the statistics which was announced, the FAO said worldwide food inflation is the highest in the past 15 years. The South African farmers produce enough food affordably that score increased with 11.5 points to 79. I think the areas where we're struggling in this component is inequality. We dropped 12 points from 40 down to 30 points, which is not a good score for us. And I think everybody would understand in South Africa, especially in 2020, inequality certainly got worse and is not good for us. That's something that we'll have to work on in terms of access and affordability of food there. Other points that are still good is agricultural import tariffs. Seems to be okay. Food safety net programs, we dropped 25 points, and I want to spend a little bit time on that. So food safety net programs is measured in 3 different categories, actually 4. Presence of a program, the funding of a program, the coverage, and the operations of the program. We did reasonably well in 3 of those, but I think on the funding one, we scored 0 in 2020. And I think that's got a lot to do with COVID and especially the food schemes at our schools that got disrupted and the funding was not allocated to that. So I think that's one of the reasons why we dropped the 25 points. Still a real good score in 75 and in a green area for us. So that's affordability, a little bit down. Look at availability. You can see our score is in the mid-ranges at 49.5. And down 1.4, not a huge change. And the areas that I want to talk about here is the one that probably dropped the most is 12, with 12.1 points is agricultural research and development. And that category is measured in 2 components. The first one is public expenditure on research and development. And we've seen the trend on that going down in the last, since 2012. The second component there is access to agricultural technology, education, and resources. Both of them went down drastically from 2012. So I think that is certainly an area where we need to engage with government. And obviously, companies like ourselves and industry need to come to the party in terms of investment and access to technology and education in agriculture itself. If you look at the volatility of agricultural production, we read there. And then lastly, food security and access policy, we got 0 there as well. That is basically 2 components that gets measured. First of all, does the country have a formal food security strategy? And then secondly, do we have a food security agency that focus on food security, monitoring, influencing on that? And there we got a low score as well. So I think those are 2 areas that we can work with government and industry to see how can we influence that to get that score up for South Africa. The 2 components where we went up in our score is quality and safety. And you can see we really did well in those components with, I think the star in that leg would be nutritional standards, which went up with 50 with a high score of 76.5. I think the new area that we started measuring is natural resources and resilience. With a score of 49, I would say that's probably an average score, but we went up to 5.1. The 2 areas that still red, which I think is not a surprise, especially with the work that AGRISA is doing on that with good data, is water. That's basically measured by agriculture water risk quantity and quality. So on both, we really had a low score. And then the second red area for us, there's oceans, rivers, and lakes. And we really got a low score there as well. And those are areas that I know AgriSA and other industry players are playing in, that we need to focus on moving forward to make sure that we've got sustainable resources to maintain the area where we're in food security. So in short, there's lots of information. And if you go to the website, you'll be able to get access to a spreadsheet that shows you all the scores from 2012 to 2020 and all these areas. What is the source of the data? What is the scoring trend in terms of that? And that would be able to inform you to see how you can play a role influencing NGOs, government, companies like ourselves, AgriSA, and other industry bodies to help all of us to collectively work to improve our scores. So, Ivor, in short, that is the detail that I have. We're happy to take any questions with the time that's left.
Thank you, Tony. And the questions are certainly streaming in here on my inbox. Many people emailing info@foodformzansi.co.za. We'll also be checking any moment now if there are any questions that have come through on social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, as well as YouTube this morning. Maybe let's pop a couple of questions on the screen. The first poll, and I would love it if you could participate wherever you are in the country or even across the globe right now. Which category is the most important to you? I've seen that there are many agriculturists and also farmers specifically here. Click on the screen, your preference. What is the most important to you? Affordability? Is it availability? Is it quality and safety? Or natural resources and resilience? We'll give it another second. I see that many people are also already popping some questions here in the Q&A section. That's fantastic. Wow, Ansel Adams is also here. He's the Chief Executive of Beef Ledger SA, doing amazing work in terms of bringing technologies to the beef sector, amongst others. Okay, great. Let's close that question and see if there's maybe, what is the most important to participants, our attendees here today? It seems to be affordability. 37% of those participating believing that affordability is the most important. Right, let's get Pratima back on screen as well as Tony for a couple of questions that have popped in. We do have a couple of minutes left. And I'm going to go with the first question that I'm seeing. It's from Ansel Adams. I know he's from Beef Ledger SA. And Ansel's saying, why are humans, skills, culture, etc., not part of the mean index TP to determine food security? Why are humans, skills and culture, etc., not part of the mean index or the main index to determine food security? Pratima, shall I throw that one to you?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks very much, Ivor, and thanks for that question. It's obviously a very important question. However, I just want to kind of highlight again that this is a global index. So what we are trying to do is really examine the underlying drivers of food insecurity, and to be able to compare that globally, we have to really kind of, disaggregate down to a very basic level. And based on the Roman Convention of '96, we also kind of looked at that definition to be able to examine what exactly does it mean for populations to be food secure. Of course, affordability, availability, and be able to have access to healthy food, so quality and safety were aspects of this. We have included climate risk this year because it is important. When it comes to behavior and culture, it becomes much more difficult to compare across countries. And I guess the context of one country in terms of behavior and culture can be very different from that of another, particularly even if you just look at income levels. And so we've tried very hard to make sure that index breaks it down in a way that's easily comparable across. And also that is something that we can try and get policy decisions on. So being able to serve the very basic needs of populations that governments can actually make some policies and inform. So that's just a very quick, I guess, a response from me. Of course, if we were to do these on a more country level, then there would be cultural factors. Tony, I'll hand over to you. I know you have something to say as well.
Thank you, Ivor. What I would add to that, if you look at agricultural research and development, the second component to that is access to agricultural education, I think, which can deal with the human factor as well. And I think on both those areas, we didn't score too well. And the USDA was the source of that data. So I think in terms of agricultural education, certainly for farmers and people that wants to enter the agricultural market, there's some work to be done in terms of that as well.
Temba Shabanga's got a very interesting question. He says, while I understand that this is a global index, can the data be disaggregated by South African provinces? If so, how are the different provinces performing? I'm not sure if the data went to such an extent. Pratima, Tony?
So at this point, it's a country level data set. Of course, it would take a while to be able to disaggregate. These are drivers of food security across. There's a lot of value, of course, to be able to disaggregate this by provinces, particularly in large countries, and to be able to define and determine what is driving food insecurity in different cities, states, that sort of thing. At this point, though, in terms of the data, given that it's 113, it's not done. But of course, there are possibilities for this to be done at a subnational level in terms of the drivers. They stay very much the same.
Wadia from Bishop Lavis is saying, thanks for Mzansi, love the discussion and the work. Wow, what a humbling moment for South Africa, and not in a good way. I'm wondering what policy changes we should bring about to better food security in our country. I'm going to throw that one to you, Tony. Are there specific policy changes that are obvious that we should be bringing about, to aid all of us?
Yeah, I would say that I'll be led by the scores that we got into specifically in terms of availability. In the two red areas is the volatility of ag production, and that's obviously companies like ourselves bring technology to farmers to be able to deal with that volatility, like climate and the resources that are natural resources that are declining. And then secondly, I think what we can do is obviously engaging government and academic institutions. We're working with Professor Cheryl Hendricks from the University of Pretoria that are looking at the data points that are used by the unit, and are that data up to date to make sure that we're getting the right scores. And so the second one that I would throw in is food security, access policy and commitments. Do we have a clear strategy? And secondly, probably propagating for an agency, whether that's a public-private partnership or run by the industry that is driving this. I think that'll probably have some impact in terms of the scoring that we have at the moment.
I agree with Tony. Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here. I think that Tony brought up some very interesting points. The one thing I'll say is, to his point on making sure that we are actually collecting data, that has been a very key central part of this. It's very important because we can only manage what we measure. And so it's very critical to be able to really have that updated data, be able to ensure that someone is tasked with collecting it and reporting it at a national level to start with, of course, and then even at a subnational level in order to ensure that this is a priority for national government.
Great. The next question comes from a farmer, if I remember correctly, from Nkubiso in the Eastern Cape, Busisiwe. She's also just graduated as a citizen journalist trained by Food for Mzansi. And Busisiwe is asking if agricultural research and development rates zero, could it be that there is no budget going to that component from the government? And she describes it as rather problematic. Who wants to have a go at that?
I'm happy to sort of give a quick explanation of what we've incorporated in agricultural research and development. Then I think Tony can provide a little bit more of that color local context. In terms of ag R&D, what we measure are two things. One is public sector, I guess, commitment or a focus on ag. And that's basically measured by looking at the Agricultural Orientation Index, which is essentially a measure of how much expenditure is highlighted on ag versus the value or GDP proportion coming from ag. So it's really highlighting how much of a priority agricultural spending is, public spending is in agriculture. That's one. And on the second component is, of course, agricultural private sector. It's sort of a proxy for private sector investment, and that's looking at access to ag tech, education and resources. And there we use this total factor productivity of agriculture. That essentially looks at, I have all of these inputs, whether it's machinery, capital, labor, and what is the returns on those inputs in agriculture. So those are sort of the two components of this. Of course, we see that on a public side, to address that question, of course, more can be done, and even TFP or total factor productivity can be improved. Tony, I'll turn it over for some local insight there.
Sure, thank you, Ivor. I think it's a good question. So first of all, I think it rests on public as well as private sector. The first component is public, and we didn't get zero. I think the score in 2020 was 59. We dropped to 46. And the second one is on the shoulders of the industry and private sector, access to technology and education and resources. There we dropped from 54 to 43. So I think it's a combined effort that needs to happen, certainly influencing the public budget that are afforded to agriculture. Then secondly, the industry and private sector to invest in that as well. So the scores are not zero. I think we just have a reasonable low score. So there's work to be done. And we'll have to get together to see how do we influence and how do we bring our own resources to that factors as well.
So Food from Mzansi, certainly readers love their how-tos. And Yvonne was asking, what is a food safety net? And I see there are at least 3 other emails popping with a similar question. So maybe we should take a step back and Pratima, just explain the food safety net to people who are not familiar with the concept.
Absolutely. So I think the food safety net is a subset of a social safety net. So essentially what it's looking at is, are there any programs that are either funded by the government or by international organizations or multilaterals like the World Food Program that are providing some basic or very base level of support when it comes to vulnerable groups and populations. So that is essentially a social safety net program. A food safety net program is essentially one where that's focused on food. So we can think of these as different things like food banks that provide free food or very, very subsidized food for vulnerable groups, subsidized rations or specific produce that is provided by public sector shops to populations below the poverty line, for instance. So essentially different types of mechanisms or a direct cash transfer. We have seen, particularly in COVID, one of the ways in which governments have responded in order to make sure that their food safety nets are reaching the most vulnerable in a way that is, I guess, targeted. They've used digital mechanisms. And of course, in Africa and South Asia and other parts, we see direct cash transfers through digital wallets has been quite successful. So government to person. Those are the different types of food safety net programs. Anything that assures a certain minimum level of food available that's affordable, of course, because it's usually at no cost from the public sector to households and individuals.
Wow, the questions are now really streaming in here, and the participants could easily keep you all busy for another hour or so, but we have about 7 minutes left. But don't worry, if we don't get to your question today, Corteva Agriscience, AGRISA, and Food for Mzansi will certainly revert with answers. Also stay tuned to foodformzansi.co.za, where we'll be we'll be answering most of these questions that you have posed, and we'll be sure to get them answered by experts. Esther Herzog wants to know, she says, South Africa's food security is continuously at risk following severe droughts, natural disasters, and so-called black swan events. The absence of a coherent and integrated sector response supported by appropriate policy instruments threatens South Africa's long-term food security, says Esther. And then a question, what are your response on the statement? Tony, I don't know if you want to take this one.
Yeah, I think certainly that I would say that a risk desk at AGRISA has done real good work in terms of understanding how to deal with that. I think with the plan that we have in South Africa is probably driven more than by the private sector than by the public sector at the moment. So it's absolutely, we can't get away from the risks that are coming in terms of climate and availability of resources. I don't think we are at the right space in terms of dealing with that. At the moment, there are certain responses from government in cases of drought, but we do not have, I think, a sustainable plan around that. Certainly good work done by AgriSA, and I think we should, as an industry, build around that and see how we can help farmers to deal with those things like droughts and other things that we cannot manage. That just comes our way, and we need to be able to have almost a safety net for farmers to keep them on their farms as well during periods like that.
Loads and loads of questions, but I'm going to take one more. The rest will be answered in different formats before I introduce our next guest. Maluta is saying COVID-19 exposed the vulnerabilities of the South African food system, add injury to the wound. The government doesn't seem to understand these vulnerabilities, which is evident from the policies and regulations, restrictions they make. Will you be sharing this information, the Global Food Security Index, with government and taking them through it for possibly better decisions going forward? An opportunity, I read that. And the person also says it would also be nice to have this done at a granular level to show which provinces are more vulnerable. Your closing remarks, Tony and Pratima.
Pratima, you go first.
Sure thing. Yeah, so absolutely. Couldn't agree that using this as a benchmarking tool to be able to drive policy, to be able to highlight strengths, weaknesses, has been a very important feature of this. We do, of course, set up some time to speak with officials that are interested in order to highlight different areas of focus and priorities going forward. And yes, completely agree that it would also be good to be able to do this at a more granular level and provided the data is available. So definitely something we can explore in the future. But as of now, I think 113 countries and looking at it at a country level and then taking it deeper for individual countries is probably the right approach. But completely agree that using this to have conversations is the way that we've intended for it to be used. So very much appreciate that comment.
Tony?
Thank you, Pratima. I think certainly the reason why Corteva is involved with the GFSI is to provide insights to governments, NGOs, and ag companies, as well as the industry to be able to influence and change. So the answer is yes, we will certainly do that. And part of doing that today is sharing that with AgriSA that certainly has got lots of contact and influence on government, and certainly we'll be part of that voice as well.
Christopher Nerida is the Executive Director for AgriSA, a man that I know the government sometimes listen to. Krista, great having you here. In short, your closing remarks, Krista.
Thank you, Ivor, and thank you to all our participants and all of our guests. I think it was a very insightful discussion this morning. And you've left me with a specific idea, which I will certainly pursue with Tony as well as Pratima and my colleague Mishali, perhaps to look at an index that can make the more granular data available, especially at the South African level, because this is something that we need to monitor. So I wish to extend my word of appreciation to the following people. That's first and foremost to you, Ivor, and Food for Mzansi for the role that you've played this morning in facilitating this discussion. Also to Pratima from the Economist Intelligence Unit for the research done and for the presentation this morning. And also then to Tony Esmeraldo and also Barbara Busata for your involvement in this project today. And then to my colleagues, Michelle Itala, and also our media and marketing team, Aloise and Tia, Team Agri-SA, I think you've done well. I want this to be an annual event, and perhaps next year to have a more specific focus on the granular detail that is applicable to South Africa. So in conclusion, great presentation, great webinar, and it lays the basis for us to play a bigger role in monitoring the food security situation in South Africa and even in the SADC region, because that will give us the necessary toolkit to improve in terms of the index. Thank you very much once more from Agri-SA side.
Thank you, Christo, and also a word of thanks for the specific role that you are playing, as well as Agri-SA, with regards to food security in South Africa. That brings us to the end of today's webinar on the Global Food Security Index, the latest index made available, and also specific findings about South Africa that was very, very relevant to our country. I'm not sure if any of the other participants would like a quick word, maybe one last word. Going, gone. Thanks for joining us. Stay tuned to Food for Mzansi for an article about today's webinar a little bit later today. Tony?
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining, and have a good day and be safe.
Thank you.